Welcombe Community Radio in the heart of Shakespeare country, for the community, by the community, in the community.
Nice.
Community rocks. Community rocks on Welcombe Radio from 3 to 4 every Friday afternoon. And good afternoon to you. We are continuing today our discussion about the Stratford upon Avon Neighbourhood Development Plan, and we're lucky to have with us Councillor Philip Applin, who will be taking us through the part of the plan which is dealing with the town centre and the infrastructure, which I think, just listening to Jenny a little bit about last week on housing, is going to be complicated, to say the least. And now turning to Phil. And good afternoon. We've been talking about that part of the Neighbourhood Development Plan, the town centre and infrastructure. And we look at first about the town centre. What do you think are the most important things that you considered during the development of the Neighbourhood Plan?
Well, I think you have to recognise the importance of Stratford in heritage terms, because, you know, we have an awful lot of history, Shakespeare, etc., and an awful lot of the surroundings represent that and recognise that. Also, we like to think that Stratford upon Avon is a, if you like, a vibrant town centre. It has its problems, and it needs to be really to be managed forward. Those are the two most important aspects of it, I think, and everything sort of stems from there.
Mm-hmm. So could I just ask a little bit about the process? You know, going right back to when you started on this project.
Right.
As a group, did you sit around and think, what are all the aspects? Can we identify all the different aspects that need to be considered?
Yes, I mean, right at the beginning, believe it or not, in 2011, we sat down and we had groups of people who focused on different aspects of the town and the plan. And the town centre group, we had about 5 people who looked at the requirements, basically, and we did what's called a SWOT analysis, believe it or not, which is strengths, weaknesses and opportunities and threats. In other words, we went right back to basics, and it all stemmed from there. The people who were involved had previously been involved in town centre development, so they knew what they were basically talking about. And we hired a lecturer to study the town and to come up with his recommendations as well. So, in essence, the centre of the town is very important, and one has to look at focal points. For instance, the town has some very important focal points or anchors, like the theatre. Would you believe the Rother Street Market is very important as a focal point, Marks and Spencer's, and there are others. And these focal points are intended to attract businesses around the centre and improve the activity. One of the most important things we need to maintain in Stratford is basically a retail environment. But we recognise that we have restaurants and bars and coffee shops, and they're very important to the town. Also, people live in the town, and that's something we have to pay a lot of attention to. One of the problems we have at the moment, as you well know, I'm sure, is the internet, and the internet basically is taking business away from town centres, and Stratford is suffering just like any other, and that's something we have to combat.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask, just thinking about the internet, and obviously this is Black Friday,
Yep.
And local retailers are looking for ways to combat the age of the internet. It's now a lot more prevalent, its effects today, than it was back in 2011. So were you already predicting how things might change?
Absolutely, yes, we did, and it wasn't as bad. I say bad's the wrong word to use, perhaps, but it wasn't quite so invasive as it is now. But the theory and the plan, if you like, for how to deal with it, I don't think's changed. I wouldn't like to see it go towards the point where shops are just showrooms and you go and have a look at what you want to buy and then you go to the internet and you buy it. I know a lot of companies, in fact, are sort of preempting that by providing their own showrooms, and basically you then order from them on the internet. But these are the things that we've got to take account of. So really the objective is to make Stratford-upon-Avon an attractive place to come to and buy. That's what it's all about. So we need to maintain, for instance, the ambience of the corridor, for want of a better word, between the birthplace and Holy Trinity Church, the High Street. All those sort of adjoining streets need to be maintained and enhanced so that it's an attractive place to shop. And very, very unfortunately, there are one or two streets which are not very attractive. Greenhall Street is one of them, and that needs to be looked at. Also, a long overlooked asset to the town is Bridge Street, going up from the River Bridge, up the hill, towards, you've got Barclays Bank at the end by the roundabout. That needs to be looked at. It's very controversial because you've got car parking and taxis and blue badge and people, etc., etc. And we're planning there to, if you like, narrow the road carriageways, widen the pavements, create a nice ambient atmosphere with trees down the middle, and generally a feeling of what we like to call shared space. And that's a very important facet of modern town centres. Trying to create an environment where people, cyclists, cars can live in a sort of an environment together without being in competition. And I think that's extremely important. Also, one thing I didn't mention, of course, is the whole question about whether you go for pedestrianisation throughout the whole town. That's not something we're planning to do at the moment because I think it's very contentious for Stratford. But one thing we are before to do is to, in fact, have a 6-month trial of pedestrianising the High Street, just to see how that works out. I think it has been tried before, but not particularly successfully. But it needs to be had a look at, and we need to use that, if you like, as a route map for how we deal with things in future. Should we talk about the Neighbourhood Centre at this stage?
Well, I was just thinking, if we could go back to, you talked about the corridor leading up to Trinity Church and the Shakespeare Birthday. So while you were making plans about modern-day Stratford-upon-Avon, did you have to take into account the heritage of Stratford-Avon as well, what we have inherited from previous generations?
Well, very, very simply, no change. It's as simple as that. I know, having said that, Henley Street is the subject of a makeover at the moment, and I know that at the Shakespeare Birthplace end on the other side, they are looking at some development there, but that would all be very, very sympathetic to the sort of ethos that we're talking about here. So the answer is no change. And we want to make sure that any new shop fronts, any thing that changes on the high street is compatible with a set of rules, if you like. I think that's about it, actually.
So you mentioned those rules. Are those rules that you established amongst yourselves, or are those national rules, county council level, district council level?
They're based on the environment as it appears at the moment, and recognising the heritage. Sorry, I'm not being very explicit here, but it's a matter of good taste, really, I suppose. There are examples where certain companies wanted to have flashy, shop fronts, which very much promoted their own logos, and we've objected to that, and we said, you need to be sympathetic with what you're putting in. It needs to go in and be compatible with the environment. Also, too much signage is not a good thing, we think, certainly in parts of Stratford, and that's something that we are, in fact, have a policy to reduce the amount of signage on the street, basically.
And I think that's something which nationally people are looking at. There's too too much signage,
Yes.
then people switch off from it. They don't actually pay attention to it.
Well, you don't, exactly.
Yeah.
So what's the point of having it done, really, in reality? We need to provide as much as is necessary to enable people to know where they're looking, for what they're looking.
Now, you mentioned a second corridor there, which is really about the link with the Maybird and the town centre.
Yes. I mean, when we come on to infrastructure, we can talk about the Birmingham Road separately, but the main objective here is to recognise that the Maybird Centre is a competitor, if you like, with the town centre from a retail point of view. And what we'd like to do is to have a more integrated approach between the two. And the important thing to do is to provide a comfortable, easy-to-use corridor. So in other words, to improve the environment, the ambience of the Birmingham Road, the pavements along down there towards the town centre. And very importantly, you may be aware that there's a block, if you like, on the corner of Arden Street and Birmingham Road, which is currently, I was going to say derelict's the wrong word to use, but which basically is empty at the moment, and that needs to be redeveloped in what we think is a mixed development of obviously a combination of retail, business and very importantly housing, and also very importantly to provide an actual walking, cycling corridor from the corner of the Birmingham Road into the town centre, so that you have this corridor overall. It makes ease of use, ease of access between the two. Very important.
And included within all of that, I mean, I know that on the continent they do a lot of their building in their town centre. They make sure that there are actually people living in the centres so that they don't become dead spaces,
Yes.
you know, after shops close and so on. Is that part of something that you've been looking at?
Well, that's explicitly part of the plan itself, and we recognise that town centres will progressively become, if you like, more mixed in the sense that you will have residences. Yes, there are some now, but I think that will increase significantly over the years. And we have to accept that there are even some shops in Stratford upon Avon which are closed. And we have to look at ways and means of utilising that space. But again, maintaining the appearance of Stratford. So whatever we do in terms of allowing residential activity needs to be done in sympathy with the town as it stands.
You didn't realise that... well, you said, well, we have got a lot of talent in this area.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of those aspects of that, linking to what we were just talking about, is, of course, leisure and entertainment. Have these things been considered? I mean, we have the new cinema in the town. What do you call it? The town
Square.
Town Square, yes.
Let's call it Town Square, whatever. Yes, the answer to that is yes, and there's been an awful lot of discussion about this, and it's quite contentious, really, because you may remember that we had the Chicago rock place on Greenhill Street, and that caused problems for residents. I think the general feeling is that we need to provide entertainment, we need to provide sports facilities near the centre of town, but not actually in the centre of town, and possibly what's called the regeneration area around the canal would be a good location for that. But it's very important to cater for young people, and I think it's generally recognised that young people are not properly catered for in Stratford upon Avon, and we don't want to think of ourselves as a load of old fuddy-duddies who sort of are basically opposing change, because that certainly isn't the case. And the new cinema, I think is very good. I know it's another controversial subject, but no, I think I'm very much in favour of that.
And is this something that I mean, just the picture I get is the complexity of all these different things that have to be considered.
Absolutely.
And how to integrate them.
Yeah.
And were there times that you were just pulling your hair out, going, how do we make this work?
Just arguments, basically, and friendly discussions between... and, of course, there are other teams working as well, so there was a lot of interaction between teams in terms of things that sort of crossed over the boundaries, if you like.
And one of the things I like to come across within that, we talked about the development of corridor, and you briefly mentioned about cycling. Is that something that you've been focusing on not just on the corridor between Maybird and the top of the town centre, but right across the town centre as a whole?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's an awful lot of pressure to improve the facilities for cyclists in Stratford. There's the cycling group. It's part of the town transport group to actually come up with a strategy for this. Our view is very simple. We need to have better corridors across town and around town for cycling and pedestrians, of course, very, very importantly, both equal. But nevertheless, at the moment, I don't think they're adequately catered for. And people will say riding their bike up the Birmingham Road is not a very pleasant experience. Riding over the bridge, round the gyratory, in fact, you name it. And of course, we have cyclists on pavements, which is technically illegal, and that's, you can understand. But again, these things need to be sorted out, and that's a very important focus of the plan.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel with what you've been developing that it meets the needs of cyclists as much as you are able within the overall structure?
I think that's probably true, but there's a fair amount of detail that's got to go sort of onto the page, so to speak. And also, for any of this, you have to recognise that any change equals money, and funds have to be provided and prioritised to make improvements. So it's not a simple story of just let's do this, let's do that, whatever. Mm-hmm. We have to be realistic about what we can achieve. But remember that the neighbourhood plan is a route map for doing things. It's a framework to enable things to happen and to make sure they happen in an orderly, sensible fashion to meet the needs of the community.
Mm. And so this is why you're encouraging people to get out next Thursday and to vote.
Yes, I can't as a councillor invite people to vote yes, but I would suggest you go and vote because it's important that you do recognise, to recognise the importance of this, because this basically is what is going to set the framework for Stratford in the future. Mm-hmm. And it works alongside the core strategy, but it's in far more detail, and it's quite prescriptive in terms of what it says we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So let's move on to the other major area that you've come to talk about, which is the infrastructure.
Yeah, I think just to say up front, infrastructure is something which is not specifically, we cannot specifically impose rules about infrastructure because it's not technically speaking part of the plan. We can advise, and we've gone to a lot of trouble to think about it and advise, because infrastructure is required in order to make life livable, if you like. Mm-hmm. And when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about roads, hospitals, and education, amongst other things. So that's the starting point, and we have a section on infrastructure. Let's deal with various problems that I know people... Sorry, go on.
Can I just ask, so who has overall responsibility? Is that a district council, a county council? Is that part of the core strategy?
Well, they should work in conjunction with each other. The core strategy specifically is not an infrastructure document, although it does make certain rules and stipulations. Mm-hmm. But the county council are responsible for infrastructure, relief roads, any changes, and pavements as well. So buses, then they're responsible for transport. So I suppose the buck stops with them, really.
Could I just ask, could you just explain, for those who maybe have not listened to the interview done with Jenny, what the core strategy is?
Well, the core strategy basically covers the whole of the district, the Stratford district, if you like. And it covers, in a sense, I was going to say all aspects of life. Very, very important core of it, of course, is housing development and where it's likely to take place. And there are sites allocated, and you've probably heard of Longmarston and Gaydon Light, Hornheath, etc. And it puts a set of rules down for housing development and the characteristics of housing developments. So it's quite detailed. Well, it comes a large number of pages. And it talks about if you like, the towns to a certain extent, but it doesn't go into as much detail as we do, for instance, on the Stratford-upon-Avon town centre. Mm-hmm. I don't think so I'm not a core strategy man really. I mean, I know some of it, but I mean, for instance, if you talk about infrastructure, then Long Marston 3,500 houses is not allowed to be built until a relief road is actually in place, which sort of enables traffic to come out of Long Marston and go back in again. You can only build 400 houses there, and a relief road must be available. And the core strategy is very clear about that, for instance. So it does deal with infrastructure in a sense.
So the development plan then has, I mean, you described it earlier as a land-based plan. So it's about how to marry those together as best as
well. Let's deal with the Birmingham Road, for instance, and that sort of brings in a lot of things really. The Birmingham Road is a recognised problem, and it's the bane of our lives really. And it needs sorting out. There is a plan which is funded to improve the Birmingham Road, and that is by creating a slip road into Tesco's and effectively providing double lanes going south from the A46 roundabout. Sorry, I'm getting into detail here, but the idea is to relieve traffic to a certain extent, but it doesn't go far enough, and that's quite a lot of money. We need a lot more money. Where's that going to come from? One of the areas that we need to focus on is, for instance, how can we relieve the Birmingham Road itself? And we promote the idea of a new road which goes from the station. Now, you know the station's now connected to the Ulster Road, so Ulster Road station alongside the old railway, in fact by and on an old railway track, over the canal and down to Hamlet Way, which is just on the north side of where all the problems are. So basically you're bypassing the town centre, and one of the benefits of that is you can actually get rid of the traffic lights on the Western Road. Now if you know the Western Road and those two sets of traffic lights with Arden Street and the Western Road, you'll know that's where all the bottlenecks are. If you can get rid of those traffic lights, then that's really good news. But a lot of money is required, and I wouldn't know exactly where it's going to come from, but possibly there is which I haven't really spoken about, is the regeneration area of Stratford. In other words, improving the canal zone, providing a lovely environment along the canal itself, providing housing, because we need to satisfy our housing quota, and some business as well. And as I mentioned earlier on, recreation, entertainment. In other words, a mixed environment to completely rejuvenate that part of Stratford, and that would then eliminate the problems on the Birmingham Road, hopefully, and maybe even pay for them. I don't know. Now, the other important facet is relief roads, because Stratford needs to have a means of, if you like, enabling traffic to go through one side, come from one side to the other, and that's something we cannot be prescriptive over. We can advise that relief roads are required, or a relief road is required, and we do that very strongly in the Neighbourhood Plan. But what we say is that proper analysis of the requirement needs to take place where routings are required. So specifically, we don't specify a southwestern relief road. I'm not going to comment on that because it's not appropriate for me to do so, but we think it's very important in the near future that you have relief roads. And of course, Long Marston development depends on a relief road. So that's a very important aspect of, if you like, traffic infrastructure in Stratford-upon-Avon. We must alleviate the traffic across the Clopton Bridge. Also, you may be aware that there's a plan which is funded by developers to improve the junction on the south side of the bridge between, naming roads again, the Banbury Road, the Shipston Road and the Tiddington Road, to create more of a balance and to ease traffic coming off the Tiddington Road and onto the bridge. So those things are all planned to go ahead, and they're funded, and they will happen probably starting next year. I don't think I really want to say anything more about infrastructure, unless you've got anything further, further comments.
No. I would like to go back to the canal, because obviously, you know, that Birmingham has done a lot of work with their canal area, and so on. So, and also Jenny talked a bit about last week about developing green areas. So, is the canal area identified as one of those potential green spaces?
It would be. I mean, just going back to green spaces for a moment, all the town councillors identified green spaces in their wards, and those are in the plan. The ones that you know and love are there. There were ones that we tried to get in and couldn't because of potential development, and I won't go into that. But they are there. The green spaces are pretty much preserved. The canal will be an additional green space. There will be quite a wide corridor, I think at least on one side of the canal, basically along the length towards and beyond Mason's Road, Timothy's Bridge Road, and that will create, if you like, a breathing space and a place for recreation. The area of the canal, which is industrial to a certain extent, and there are car dealerships and what have you around, that is earmarked for some housing development and also for businesses, high-tech businesses which would be very suitable for the town. So there's quite a lot of change planned in that area, and that will happen over the next 10 years or so. Well, 2031 is when the plan sort of matures, and that's something which is being managed. We sort of kicked it off in the neighbourhood plan, but it's actually being managed by the district council at the moment, and they have consultants working on it. And they have to work with all the existing businesses to see where they should be best located. So it's a very complicated set up. But the canal is an amenity which has never, ever been exploited properly before, and it's about time it is. And that's basically the message.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And you, if I can bring you on to one other point with that, we've mentioned today and in more detail with Jenny Fradley's interview about housing development. So alongside of that, have you taken into account things like education facilities, maybe more medical facilities?
Well, I mean, as you know, the new hospital is up and running, and that's a brilliant piece of work, and more power to the elbow of the local health services. Fantastic. In terms of schooling, that's somewhat more, I was going to say, problematic. You may be aware that when a housing development takes place, then the developers are responsible for contributing the necessary money to take account of the effect of their development. In other words, so if there are more children coming into the area, then clearly they have to be schooled. And that, for instance, is true of the new development taking place at Bishopton. There is a new school being planned, new junior school being planned for that. For instance, in Alveston, I suspect there will be increases in the size of the school there at some stage. So education is dealt with at the junior level. When you talk about the senior level, if you talk about secondary schools, then of course they come in big chunks, and we have, I was going to say, we have the high school, which is some years ago was very successfully upgraded. We have the grammar schools. But we do need a new secondary school, and I suspect that will probably be built at Long Marston if that development goes ahead. But if it doesn't, then it presents a little bit of a problem. And I think our recommendation at the moment is that there needs to be a new secondary school south of the river. Where that actually is open to question. Finally, we talk about health and education, special needs education, and we have the Welcombe Hills School, which has sort of overrunning almost, I think, and I think they have some new accommodation, which is perhaps not optimal. We've put a recommendation in that there needs to be a new special school south of the river, and if you look at a map of all the locations where the children who go to that school live, then you can see that's probably quite a good location for convenience of travel and what have you. So that's something that we've put in the plan as a policy, as a recommendation, because again, it's part of the infrastructure section.
So finally, in this part, the thing that has come over to me in talking with both of you and others is that you've attempted to create a cohesiveness between all these different aspects. In a sense, what sounds like will be quite a rejuvenation of Stratford upon Avon.
Absolutely, yes, that's right.
Yeah. So, what would happen? Is the question I put to Jenny at the end. What would happen if the referendum wasn't passed, or the vote wasn't passed, what would happen to all these plans?
Well, I suppose at the end of the day, the plan would exist in some kind of draft form. And like all plans, and there are plans which have been issued by Stratford-upon-Avon in the past, people would take account of it. But it would not, there would be no legal teeth in place to prevent certain things happening. I'll give you a good example, which is that one of the very important policies in the plan is to maintain what we call strategic gaps, which, for instance, would be between Stratford, Tiddington and Alveston as villages. We need to maintain them as separate entities, not have, if you like, a Stratford conurbation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's something which is enshrined in the plan, and woe betide any developer who actually sort of wants to put houses where that would be compromised. And we've had, I won't go into details, we've had an instance of that already, which has failed because of this view about strategic gaps. Coalescence is the word that the district council uses. That's an important thing. Now, whether that would be compromised if the plan didn't go ahead, I don't know. So it's anybody's guess, really, but you really do have to have a legal framework in which to develop the town. You know, this is a plan by the people, for the people. It's not the town council's plan, it's the people's plan.
Yes,
We just sponsored it.
That's something which I was quite intrigued by when Jane described that, about how you decided to step back and let the people develop.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. I'm a town councillor. I have been very heavily involved in the neighbourhood plan right from the beginning. But when I decided to stand for council, there was quite a lot of questions over whether I should stay involved in the neighbourhood plan.
So you were part of the neighbourhood plan before you became a councillor? Yes.
And in fact, I did stay with both, and I haven't hopefully compromised my position. But nevertheless, it was important to maintain that separation. This is the people's plan.
I think so. It was interesting about what you were saying about the gaps between, and so that Tiddington and Alveston maintain their local character.
That's right. Well, because there is the Alveston Village Design Statement, and that is in effect incorporated into our plan. It's a reference document from the neighbourhood plan, because they don't have their own neighbourhood plan. They're sort of integrated with ours.
So, can I thank you for coming and for this part of the programme, Louise? Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Much appreciated. Good. Listening intently to you, we have Paul Dunster. Thank you for coming in, Paul, and also Louise Brandon. What was one of the main things, as somebody from the outside looking in, what have you picked up from the Neighbourhood Development Plan as it stands?
Yeah, well, first thing, let me say hello and thanks for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I think one of the things that struck me when we first came across this, it lands on your doormat, referendum for this, and it's a referendum that says vote for a development plan. And you think of, well, we don't want lots of new development and houses and all that sort of stuff. So the automatic reaction is no. Whereas from what we've been hearing this afternoon, actually, what this plan will do is give the town council and the planners some sort of capability to control the development. It's not to encourage development or stop development, but as I understand it, it's really being able to control it. Have I got the right idea there?
Basically, yes. I mean, I wouldn't say we've become policemen, but to a certain extent that's true, because we cannot... Change is initiated by people who come along and decide that there's something that they want to do for whatever reason. We need to make sure that we control that change and keep it within certain tramlines, if you like. And it's as simple as that. And we have a vision for the town, and whatever changes must conform to that vision, if you like.
Yeah, well, that was the sort of second thing that struck me, is that you've put a lot of very fine comments through with us this afternoon, but they all seem to be very aspirational. Could you give us some sort of example of how the document gives you teeth to make these things happen?
Well, a good example, I suppose, would be how do you remove street clutter? it's a good point, and there needs to be a dialogue with the district council and with, I was going to say, the organisation that's responsible for the town centre to make sure that these rules are adhered to. We need to have committees that actually that actually make sure that rules are adhered to. And that, for instance, a good example would be maintaining the standards in the high street itself, the visual impact of it. And that's something that I think needs to be put in place. Once the plan is agreed, if you read aspects of the plan, you'll see that there are certain things that are stipulated that need to be literally sort of started, which don't exist at the moment necessarily. And it applies to development, for housing development, over a certain number of houses. For instance, you need some kind of a strategic plan. How does this housing development affect the neighbourhood, the surroundings? It's not just a matter of building a couple of houses on a corner here somewhere. It's more complicated than that. What's the social? What are all aspects of the development? What changes it's going to? What effect is it going to have? And these need to be properly looked at and properly analysed professionally. That's something that needs to be put in place, and it's not there at the moment, not in a formal sense, as you probably know from the various housing developments that are potentially to take place at the moment and are being planned at the moment. That sort of thing is happening, but it's happening on a very informal basis, as I see it.
Mm-hmm. So could you say that, in a sense, this has never been tried before to bring everything together?
Yeah, I think it's probably true to say that, yes. Yeah. I don't think.
So I think I'm right then that my thought that the description of it as being the Neighbourhood Development Plan is not actually the best title for it, because it does far, far, far more than just look at development. It's the development of the whole town, not just of houses and shops and roads. It's everything within the town.
Well, it's everything in a sense. You could say, well, it could just be houses, it could just be buildings, but in a sense, the issue is that nothing is independent of anything else. You have to take account of all the social aspects of change, which is why the neighbourhood plan contains sections on the environment, sections on the community, sections on business. How do we improve those areas?
Louise, let's turn to you as another outsider looking in.
Outside in one sense, but a resident.
I mean, outside of the development plan.
Yes, but I meant a long-term resident. I have read it, but I've read it online, and it's really quite as comprehensive. But you said a word about aspirational, I think.
Yes, I did. Yep.
And there's a lot of hope in there, that we would like to have things and what we're aiming for. And I suppose there's this, I have both a mix of this is fantastic and looking forward to seeing it implemented, and also with a tinge of cynicism of being a 30-year-old resident of, well, I'm not 30, but, being here a long time, and having seen how the town has grown and changed, not necessarily always with this one idea. And most of us as residents have kind of been in despair over the years, where there doesn't seem to be this joined up thinking. And it's the question you said about, Paul, about teeth, and you said too about where the teeth comes, because from my understanding of how something happens in a town, we've got all the varying, we've got a town council, we've got a district council, we've got a county council, we've got a what have you, and it's how they coordinate with each other, and who's got the town's interests at heart when you're talking of people from all sorts of different, in the district council, if I'm correct, it's not just one person, it's not made up of all people from Stratford. So if I'm incorrect in that, please.
No, not at all. I mean, I think there have been various issues with planning in the past, over the years. It's been very mixed. I think it's improving. But you do have a council structure which, to a certain extent, mitigates against it, in the sense that you have a county council and you have a district council. The town council, of course, are, if you like, a sort of first stage in the planning process, but nevertheless, it's very important that the county council and the district council operate in an integrated fashion.
Absolutely.
Because, the planning department is in the district council. All plans have to go through the district council, and that's for roads and goodness knows what else as well. They have to be formulated, in the case of roads, infrastructure, education, health and what have you, within the county council. Do they operate as a joined-up organisation? The answer is not always, how should I say. That's something which I think needs to be looked at. Am I being controversial? I don't know. But within that structure, it's up to the town council to make sure, on behalf of the residents, that the requirements of the neighbourhood plan are adhered to. And at the end of the day, it comes down to individuals. For instance, if you have something, or you see something, or something is being planned that you don't agree with, then as a resident, you should, if you like, press the right buttons.
I have exercised that right in the past, quite forcibly. So yes, I quite agree, and I think that is something that I don't know whether Paul would join me in. There, in any area, there is often a lot of apathy, maybe coming from misunderstanding or not really having time to engage in something, or just thinking, well, things are going to happen, so my view isn't important. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think that's always the case. It's always easier to leave it to somebody else to do it. Yeah.
But you sort of, it's the argument, I suppose, is we pay you to do the job. Why do we have to get involved? Which is sort of fine, but it's not, because basically there are all sorts of conflicting requirements and intentions and objectives. Not everybody has the same agenda, do they? So,
Well, something in point that you talked about, which was entertainment. If you talk to a group of youngsters, it would depend whether they're what age group, and also what they're wanting, and that could be in direct conflict with residents and tradespeople.
Yeah, you have to allow for the fact that young people have to let off steam, and it's important that they are allowed a certain amount of freedom. You can't just sort of basically stamp on, because if you do that, then it squeezes out the side. So it's not sensible. What you have to do is accommodate, and one of the ways of doing that, of course, is to provide them with the facilities in the right location, which isn't contentious. And Greenhall Street certainly wasn't. And that's a shame, really, because a useful, in many ways, facility no longer exists.
We have to put it up because we have Connecting the Dots are getting ready to start their program. I think we could have carried on for a good half hour or more. But one of the things, just picking up briefly on what Paul and Louise were saying, that this, prior to the neighbourhood plan, there hasn't been a lot of joined up thinking, let's say. This is the first step in doing that, the first attempt. And of course, we always learn from something that we're doing. And again, Jenny mentioned us last week that coming up to 2031 will be the introduction of the next neighbourhood plan. So this isn't just something that's going to happen and stop. It is actually something we're going to learn from and build upon. And she was saying that already for that plan to come into place in 2031, it will have to start in the next, after the next few years, that the preparations for that will have to take place. So is this an approach that is going to develop and progress and go further, especially as we learn from this first neighbourhood development plan?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? You've got, in a sense, two major documents. One is the core strategy, and one is, for us, the neighbourhood plan. Now, next year, as I understand it, there is going to be a project initiated for the next version of the core strategy, which is for after 2031. We have not as yet discussed when we're going to start thinking about further neighbourhood planning, and I think probably it would be worthwhile taking a little bit of breathing space, because we're only just in the process of clearing a plan at the moment. Has anything changed significantly? There have been one or two changes which probably need to be thought about, but I think we should possibly have a bit of a dialogue with the district council to see where their thinking is going as well. I don't think you can just completely, if you like, operate in isolation necessarily. So let's give it a year or so. And 2031 is quite a long time away. But there has been talk of having a 5-year rolling cycle. It's taken us 8 years so far, so 7 years so
However,
far.
though, wouldn't you say that to get to this point, you've done an awful lot of groundwork that
Yes.
you wouldn't need to redo?
Oh, absolutely.
So therefore, you wouldn't be looking at necessarily another 8 years, because you've already there's
Yes,
been
it's
so
something
much
that grows
exactly.
and progresses.
And for some of the projects you talked about, the canal regeneration, which is really interesting, because I was thinking of the areas in the country that have had that regeneration, like Birmingham, and therefore this is just at a discussion stage. That's going to take years before you get anywhere, I would have thought. So that will automatically go into another rolling plan.
Paul, is there anything you'd like to add to that as we begin to wind up?
No, I think the only thing I'd like to say is really how important it is for everybody to actually go and exercise their democratic right and vote. I know which way I'm going to vote. In fact, I've done it because I've done a postal vote. But it's vital that everybody actually doesn't go with apathy. They need to go and make their statement. And I've always felt that if you don't vote, you can't complain about what the result is. So if you want to be able to complain, you need to actually exercise that right.
I endorse that completely.
Yes. Thank you. And Phil, is there anything you'd like to complete? I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about is, I think Jane described it, there's 50 volunteers or more involved with this. Just what are they going to be doing after next Thursday?
Resting, I should think.
Not contemplating our navels anyway, that's for sure. Well, I think the simple answer is, I think very importantly, everybody needs to work together. So we need to work in conjunction with the county council and with the district council. All councils, we shouldn't be fighting each other. We should be working in cooperation, I think. And that's the message, really. It is that this is local government. It's not political. It shouldn't be political. It should be all about how the community gets improved and how their environment gets improved. So that's as simple as I can be, really.
So can I say thank you for coming in and talking with us and explaining that part of the Neighbourhood Development Plan for Stratford-upon-Avon. Much appreciated.
You're welcome, sir. You're welcome.